Hello, and welcome back to the Argyle HR Leadership Forum. My name is Brittany Sullivan with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. A couple of notes to share before I turn things over to our panel moderator. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event, which include complimentary materials, information, and meet and greet opportunities. To ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat, and we will address your questions at the end of the session. Thank you again. Now let's get started. Without further ado, I would love to introduce Monique Jefferson, Chief People Officer at the Community Preservation Corporation. We're excited to have Monique and our panelists with us for a panel titled Creating Fairer and More Inclusive Employee Experiences. Welcome, Monique, and over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Very excited to be here with you today. So you're in for a treat. We're going to, about the next 30 or 40 minutes, we'll engage in a conversation around how we create more equitable and inclusive, make the employee experience more equitable and inclusive, okay? And so I will throw out the first question, and I'll direct it to DK, since, he's in the middle, closest to my left. So our first question for today's discussion is, from your experiences, what are the most effective strategies for creating more equitable and inclusive employee experience? And if you could also share any real live examples from your experience.
When you think about being equitable, you want everything to have a level playing field. But a big part of that is having a high level of transparency. So I think absolutely the number one thing is in creating an equitable environment, is to have a high level of transparency. That's number one for me. I think number two is being able to get feedback as you are creating that space in real time, so you know what's working, what's not working, and what you need to work on. And then lastly is to have a level of consistency around what you're doing, very specifically related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some examples, right? ERGs and BRGs. Hopefully most of you all either are a part of one, have created one, or have been to some of their events. Those are employee resource groups. They're affinity groups. Really important because all three things that I've just said, the feedback, the cadences, the transparency, you can do that through an employee resource group. It is a best practice in DEI. And whether you're a large company or a small company, these groups actually ensure that you have some representation of your underrepresented population, right? So some examples: women, African Americans, Latinos, your Asian population, your South Asian population, fathers, mothers, parents, right? They're different. Every company's different, but I think having these groups are a great way for you to not only ensure that you have a diversity strategy that works, but that is reflective very specifically of your work environment and your employee population.
Thanks, DK. That's great. Dimitri?
Thank you. Like DK said, I think one of the things, and it's interesting that I hadn't even spoken about this when we were getting together to formulate this panel, was that consistency you said. So I have what I call the 3 C's. Oh, thanks. Can you guys hear me better now? Sorry. Okay. Usually my voice carries, so I apologize. So I have what I call the framework for having an equitable strategy is the 3 C's: communication, consistency, and clarity. Because I feel that sets the footprint and the foundation for having a very good strategy for any organization, and also for the ERGs, the BRGs, as he talked about. So, for example, with effective communication, identifying roles of engagement, robust partnership with stakeholders, you're laying the foundation. The process, creating a positive experience for your employees. One of the other things is when we look at having equitable relationships, I feel that, as my colleague DK said, it's authenticity, right? And so if we can ensure that we have an authentic relationship with our employees, with ourselves. I said that creates a workplace where people will succeed and be successful.
No, thank you. The other thing that I would add, as I listen to both of you and some of the strategies that you talk about, can you guys hear me okay? Okay, great. When I listen to and think about the strategies that you guys just shared with us, I think what it really boils down to, if I had to summarize it, is that you've got to meet people where they're at. And you've got to create workplaces or spaces where people feel a sense of belonging and they feel connected to, right? They see themselves somewhere in the workplace, right? They feel like they can bring their whole selves to work, they feel included, and they feel that sense of connection and belonging. And that's through culture, right? It's through the culture of your workplace that you get that sense of belonging and people feel included. And so it really boils down to how are you creating the culture in the workplaces to make people feel that way, right? So whether that's through ERGs, BRGs, and some of the other strategies that's been shared, it's really meeting people where they're at. So now that we've talked about those strategies, talk to me a little bit about what metrics can be used to measure the impact of equity and inclusion on specifically on employee engagement and also overall business performance.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. I'll jump in. One thing that's worked for me and using that as a best practice is having focus groups, right? Having focus groups to find out really what the employees are thinking and what leadership is thinking. And so from that, we create toolkits, given a scorecard as well, diversity scorecards is things that we use as well, but creating that assessment and that toolkit so that you can have the 5 different measures to be able to help you gauge the engagement and measuring tools, your KPIs and so forth. But when we do that, also, the other thing is to think about when you're looking at metrics, and I always say I struggle with this, to be totally honest. I always struggle with this because if there were key metrics and strategies and KPIs that we could use to be able to deliver this, then the 3 of us wouldn't be here, right? We'd probably be on a beach somewhere in the Mediterranean. We won't say anywhere near, because of the US, all the storms that we're having, but in the Mediterranean somewhere, I'd like to be there. But I found that that's really it. I have these focus groups. With the groups, I'm able to look at and say, okay, what are the things that we can measure, right, when we look at this? And so the engagement for, like, say, attraction, right, and looking at your gaps as people come in through the process. Where are they dropping off? Are they dropping off at the interview process? Are they dropping off at the screening process? Are they dropping off at the interview to hire? And then that way I can go back and tell our stakeholders, look, if I'm using that as an example, this is where I see the drop off. There's a gap between the way that this person is coming into interview and then through the hiring process. And so what does that mean? Maybe go back and look at your interview panels. Do you have an inclusive interview panel? As DK mentioned a little bit earlier, I call it culture add versus culture fit. Are you using that type of measure when you are looking at the hiring process as well? And so some of those are kind of I don't want to say basic measurements that you can use, but they really do an in-depth job to tell you what it looks like in the talent pool and then how you can engage with your employees.
What's also key and important in your example with respect to the interview panels is that you're consistent. What I find, particularly when you are interviewing candidates of color or diverse candidates, you're asking such a wide spread of questions. And so then when you come together to do your deliberation on and assess whether or not it's the right candidate and a cultural add, it's hard for the managers to make it or the leader to make an assessment on the hire because the questions were not consistently asked of all the candidates or they weren't the right type of questions such as like behavioral interview questions. So I do think going back to your 3 C's, I think consistency is also very important in that process. I'd also add many of you I'm sure may work for organizations where a focus group sometimes may not work because the employees may not feel comfortable. You may not create an environment where there's psychological safety and where they feel safe to do that. So another tool that I know we use quite a bit is engagement surveys, right? And so sometimes employees feel a little bit more comfortable and to be a little bit more honest and direct and transparent in their responses when it's done through an engagement survey. So that's another way to measure the engagement as well. And there is something called an engagement index, where there's 4 key questions that tie back specifically to levels of engagement. So those are questions that speak to your values, whether or not the employee would refer or recommend the organization as a best place to work. So there are very specific questions that you can tie back that will help you measuring your levels of engagement.
Yeah. I'm going to get a little bit more granular because I like to give specifics as it relates to measurements, because to your point, there's so much that you could measure. But here's what I know what works, right? So first and foremost, your talent acquisition, right? Your hiring process. That means looking at your sources, right? Which sources you know that work, that bring you the most diverse candidates, whatever your diverse candidate structure is. If it's women, is it more Latinos, is it more Blacks, is it veterans, is it LGBTQ plus, et cetera, et cetera. Um, Also, your turnover, really, really key, both involuntary and voluntary. That will tell you a huge story about your diversity strategy, if it's working, if it's not working, where you may have hiccups, right? You'll start to see certain patterns with certain managers where there's turnover every 6 months in that department. You may want to look into that, right? You'll see that maybe in certain areas of, if you're an international company or a national company of your organization, there's more people leaving. So you tend to learn things about that environment, that structure, maybe those rules and regulations, or maybe just the physical location, right? You learn a lot about that. So both voluntary and involuntary is extremely important in understanding. You also want to know about where you're promoting people, right? At what level? You know, to Demetria's point, are people falling off like after they've been here for 3 years and then they realize, oh, there's no place for me to go because they don't believe that there are other opportunities for diverse people? Is it the same as your more heavily represented population? Those are comparisons that you want to see and you want to understand what's working, what's not working. The other thing that I think should be measured is what I call the EVP, the employee value proposition. What do people like about the company? Why do they stay here? Why do they leave? Right? What are the things that you can use to attract other employees and professionals? Right? You get a lot of this through the employee survey, but you also get a lot of it through basically saying these are the things that we know that work. You know, this is our values, this is our mission statement, et cetera, and getting feedback from that. You'd be amazed what you learn from your employees, both diverse and not diverse, as relates to the power of the company, the purpose of the company, or the lack of an understanding of what makes people tick, what makes them want to stay at that organization and work at that organization. And then lastly, but probably just most importantly, is what people think of DEI, right? You want to measure, that's a metric that very often you get through the employee engagement survey, but very often it's not asked directly, right? You ask all of these other questions around it without saying, you know, do you believe that diversity is a tool that attracts other people to our organization? Do you believe that, you know, you are represented as an employee? And you give this to everyone, not just your diverse employee, but you get a nice story around your strategy for attraction, your strategy and methodology for retaining your best and top talent, and also what you need to do to develop and grow your mid-level talent, or, you know, your talent that may be at risk. So those are the top things that I think from a metric standpoint would be helpful in making DEI more equitable.
You know, DK, you raised such a good point around the types of questions that you ask on any survey for that matter. And one of the things, I'm just reflecting back on the different engagement surveys that I've participated in, one of the things I noticed is that very few of them will ask very directly, do you know what our DEI strategy is? Do you believe? Do you support the DEI strategy? And based on individuals' answers, that's when you really get to the root and to the heart of how people are feeling and what's really going on. Because you can have the best strategy in the world, but if you don't have the support and the buy-in of the leaders and the managers, you're not going to be effective, nor will you be successful.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
also there are other types of surveys other than just engagement surveys. You talked a little bit about the hiring process and then also why people are leaving. So there are exit surveys. Exit surveys are a very valuable tool and a good way to get data, particularly if you have a leaky faucet and you find that there is a higher percentage of underrepresented groups that are exiting your organization versus the majority. Using that exit interview, although some people might feel like it's too late, it can still add value and can still help you. And then also with hiring surveys. So we just recently began to implement, began to implement at the 1 week, 30-day, and 90-day, these hiring surveys at different points in the onboarding process to understand, okay, why did you come here? And then how's it going? Do you feel included? Do you understand, the organization, the goals, how you're being evaluated? Do you have that sense of belonging? Do you see yourself in the organization? And those types of questions early on in the hiring and onboarding process. So now let's talk a little bit about, I mentioned psychological safety previously. Let's talk a little bit about how organizations can rebuild trust with employees who feel that their contributions are undervalued and overlooked. So talk to me a little bit about what are some of the things that organizations can do to create safe spaces and create that organizational safety and, psychological safety and build trust with the organization.
So, excellent question. I don't need this mic. I do? Okay. All right, great. Okay.
They want to make sure they pick up all the wonderful things.
All the nuggets, all the nuggets. Okay. So, excellent question. And I'm going to kind of bring you guys back a little bit to May 25th, 2020, George Floyd. And I bring that up because what George Floyd did for corporate America was actually force us to have all of these very uncomfortable conversations that we really didn't want to have, right? But what came out of that was a level of transparency in really understanding what works, what doesn't work, and us being honest about how we relate to each other and ensuring that we have a common way to not only speak about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but to also challenge ourselves to say that, I need to listen to what you're saying and I need to understand what you're saying so that I feel valued at this organization. And what came out of that is what I call allyship and advocacy, right? And that's really, really key because what that does is that brings everyone into the conversation. That brings all the people who are naysayers, that brings the people that may not understand what DEI is, but it forces you to say, well, I'm a part of this as well, and I am not being excluded, meaning I also have stake in the game, whether I'm diverse or not diverse. So I think really having those conversations is really, really key because it's been proven to provide a level of safe space and a level of psychological safety within organizations.
Plus 1,000
Yeah.
and everything that you said. One thing that I did was to help our organization through some of this process. And as DK mentioned, with the murder of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, corporate America did rethink what they were doing right and what they were doing wrong, and really had to recognize that there is a lot of oppression and systemic barriers within organizations when it came to racial justice. So what I did in working with leaders, and my background was both in law firms and in biotech, so most recently biotech and pharma, is have those roundtable sessions. We had small groups and we put out what the topic was going to be. If we were going to talk about racial injustice, and we sent it out to our department and then had people come in, and then we were doing it all virtually, of course, right then. But then we had people come into the conversations, and it really was engaging because we had leaders there. We had people who were going to be able to make a difference and make the change in what we felt were some difficult conversations and difficult things going on at that time, and to make people feel at ease, and so that they could bring their authentic self, right, to work and talk about how they really felt and how some of these issues were troubling for them and how they saw their peers, right? And so doing that, those roundtable discussions were great. I remember one of the first ones that we had was we sat and we looked at movies on Netflix, right? So we went through all the different movies that we had. Could talk about, it was like 13, and it was like the Central Park 5.
Yeah, Central Park 5.
Five. And we did that, and we sat down and we watched it as a group virtually. And then we had discussions afterwards. And then as we moved into an area of meeting people where they were, as Monique said, and created a comfort zone, then I did psychological safety training. And I did this, and because my background was in legal as well, I hosted a psychological safety program for all of 400 global legal advisors within the organization. And this request came from the chief counsel to be able to do that. And so we did that, and we had sessions. We had like 3 different sessions because they had so many different people. But we were able to have honest conversations with people and talk about with their managers. So you had people leaders, you had first level engagement, second level, leadership, and everybody there. And it was done virtually. And I was surprised that you can get together 400 people, right, to have a very honest conversation. And it really changed. It changed how people showed up at work. It changed the conversations between people leaders and their employees, because they really found out they wanted to stay at this organization, but they wanted to know that somebody heard them and was listening to them.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Can I add one thing? And I think it's because I do think it's really important. The key caveat of what Dimitri's saying and what I'm saying is that what this creates within that psychological safety is allies and advocates, right? Let me give you one example. When you're doing an ERG, an employee resource group, or a BRG, business resource group, what you don't want to do is exclude your non-diverse population, meaning if you are doing an LGBTQ ERG, you want to make sure you have people who are in that ERG that are not LGBTQ plus, right? Because if you don't, you're actually preaching to the choir. It's nice that all the LGBTQ plus people, I call them the pride community, so I'm just going to say that, can be together and celebrate and focus on things that may be challenging and have a voice and representation. But you need that level of education, right? I've actually done this at several companies, and believe it or not, we've actually had people who are not LGBTQ plus be the chair of of that group, and that worked really, really well because not only was that huge, saying that, oh, we're actually getting our message across, but it allowed other people that were not of that diaspora but within that organization, to actually open up their ears, open up their eyes, and listen, right? And then actually open their mouth and ask great questions about things they didn't understand or things they wanted to know more about. So just wanted to make sure that in providing that psychological safety, the concept of allyship and advocacy was not, kind of forgotten, and that there's a clear understanding that that is the key piece of this to ensure that you have those stakeholders a part of the process as well in providing real psychological safety.
No, absolutely. Like one of the things I always say with tragedies or unfortunate events, there are some gifts that come out of that. And so from my vantage point in 2020, there was this explosion of, some organizations called them courageous conversations. Some organizations called them fearless dialogues and some variation of that. But it was creating space and creating opportunity for employees to come together and talk about their lived experiences in the workplace and listening and coming to a place of understanding. One of the things that we did at the time with the organization that I was with is we asked a very basic question, but it was an inclusive question. It was, think about a time where you didn't feel included. You felt less than or different. And it doesn't matter if you identify as part of the diversity strands, or if you are a white male, for example, I think if we really think about it, all of us have had an experience or a time of our lives where we felt different, we felt less, we were made to feel less than, or we didn't feel included. And that really sparked really good conversation and really good, really good dialogue.
Sounds like you're about to do a privilege walk with the people in the room.
Okay. So now, what steps do you think can be taken to identify potential areas of inequity that might lead employees to consider leaving your organization and perhaps going to a competitor? So I know for us, one of the things that I try to do on a regular basis, at least every other year, is we do pay equity studies. Because if you go back to those exit interviews and you understand why people are leaving your organization, and if one of the reasons is because either they feel like they can't develop and grow, or they feel like they're not being paid fairly for their role that they're in, a pay equity study is a good way to validate if you are paying people fairly for the role that they're in. And then also not just conducting the study, but we talked about transparency and communication earlier. You got to communicate the results out to the employees so that they know, hey, we take this seriously. We conducted this pay equity study, and we can confidently say that everyone here is paid to market or paid fairly based on the role that they're in. So,
Go ahead. Ladies first.
Okay. What I say is people don't leave people, they leave the jobs, right? So when I think of it that way, Monique, to your point about having the different surveys and the engagement surveys, I think if the exit surveys are always key, and also feedback from evaluations. You know, how can you find out and stop people from leaving? Well, you have to go back and find out, why did you leave? And if people aren't having that, those tough conversations, because another thing that I say is let your discomfort be your guide. If you are feeling uneasy and not wanting to have that conversation, then find somebody else in your organization, your leadership that will. Because having those kinds of conversations with people give you the information that you need to create an inclusive environment for people in your workplace. For instance, like I said, the exit surveys, I've found out many times through my role in the legal industry and law firms is that when I sat down with people and had the conversation of why they were leaving, and I sat back and I was like, wow, this is really why you're leaving? And if you don't tell anyone else, then it's not going to help. Give you a clear example. So I was going into a board meeting with the CEO of our law firm and the chair of the law firm and other C-suite leaders. I was going in to report out on DE&I and where we were in our strategies. But before I went into that meeting, I received a call, an email, that said 2 top individuals from within our law firm was leaving. And I looked at the names of those 2 people and I almost cried, literally, because both of them I had long-term relationships with, but they also were leaders, mid-level leaders and managers within our organizations that led ERGs and other affinity groups. And so I reached out to both of them, and I can only get one on the end of the line at that time, but it wasn't about the people where they were leaving, it was the job, because looking at what kind of projects they got, right? No one really stepped up to the plate, their leaders, to give them that project. So fast forward, I go upstairs into my meeting, and before I could even start out on my presentation, I looked at the CEO and the chair and I said, we have a problem here. It was like, Houston, we have a problem. And they're like, what's going on? And when I sat down and explained to them how important it was, and how disappointed I was, and these people leaving, but the importance of giving key feedback in your evaluations and everything. So at the end of that meeting, they said, we will come back to you. And I went down to my desk and I had a handwritten note from the chair of the firm saying, I want to meet with you when I come back in town in a week, and we're going to sit down and talk about this. And so then we addressed it and changes were made. But you have to be able to have those uncomfortable conversations. And I tell you, my senior report when I went into that meeting and said, okay, sir, this is what we have to talk about. She looked at me like, oh my gosh, no, she isn't. Can I say that? But I felt it was important, and it ended up doing. So we made some changes internally that we needed to do, looking at evaluations, feedback, work products, putting together a more robust policy and plan. But that was some of the things that we did to help to increase retention. And the last thing I'll say too is ensuring that you have a great, I call it IDAP, Inclusion and Diversity Action Plan, right? That talks about attraction, talks about development for those individuals, and it talks about retention. What's your succession plan look like? Because if you don't have that, I don't call them sponsors anymore, I say success partner, and that's somebody who's talking about you when you're not in the room, then you're not going to be able to have a successful career. Or do you bring your best self to work as well?
Yep. So I think for me, and I'll make it really simple because I've seen this work really, really well, and attrition go way down. It's the three things, right? It's transparency, making sure that everyone has the same information, it's sharing the information. It's the communication, making sure that you're utilizing in all channels, your social media, right? Some companies have their own intranet, some companies have their own apps, some people do alerts and messaging, right? So it's your communication utilizing all those tools. Town halls, right? Huge opportunity to not only talk about the strategy and what's going on at the company, but really when companies say they value their employees, make sure that you're communicating at a town hall all the updates. But then lastly, and probably the most important piece of this that I think really directs an employee to either stay or not stay is authenticity. People know BS. I'm going on record to say this when they hear it, right? I'm sure you do as well. So if you're a CEO and you're at a town hall talking about how great the company is and how much money you've made that quarter, and they're not seeing it in their paychecks, or nothing's changed at the organization and you still have the same problems, they're going to more than likely start to leave. Sounds familiar, right? So I share that with you because as a person who's advised several CEOs, when I go back and say, what are we talking about at the town hall? Are we talking about, how many people we've hired, where they're from, who's been promoted, right? What are the new partnerships we have, the new clients, all these things, and I get together with our corporate functions and our communications team. That meeting usually goes from like a 30-minute to an hour, sometime to an hour and a half. And if you're a global company, now is at 12 o'clock in the afternoon and then 9 o'clock at night, right? I share that with you very seriously because employees understand that every quarter is not going to be great, right? We're always not going to be able to hire the most and best diverse talent, right? But what they want to know is that they're important, they're valued, and they're being paid fairly, right? Um, and addressing those three things in a really authentic, very focused way with a cadence where they expect that level of transparency from their executive team, their CEO, and HR really goes a long way to build trust and build accountability.
Thank you, DK. Excellent. So now we'll pivot to the next question, and it's a continuation of what some of the things that we've discussed today thus far. So how can organizations actively involve employees in the process of creating a more inclusive and equitable workplace? And what role does feedback play in that? So I know earlier on we touched upon some of those ways already through ERGs or BRGs. We've also talked about surveys as well, and allowing them to give their input and hear their voice. That's where the feedback piece comes into play. I would also add from a hiring perspective, referrals, right? So having your diverse populations or underrepresented populations refer individuals from their network is another way that you can involve them in the process and also help to diversify the organization as well. So
I think for me, and I'll take it beyond the ERGs and the BRGs, it's really about the plan, right? So now you have the ERGs, you have the BRGs, you have the engagement surveys. Well, what's the plan, right? Is the plan that we're going to make, another $1 billion in 2 years, and it doesn't matter how we do it, but we got to do it, right? So, everybody work hard, face down, make it happen. Or is the plan, I want to take you on this journey. I want to take my employees on this journey with me, and I want to hear your feedback every 3 months. And I'm going to tell you where we are in doing X to get to X to, you know, the plan. There needs to be, I think, what really ensures that that feedback works, particularly with diverse employees, is making clear what the plan is. That means telling them what the diversity strategy is, right? Whether it's been developed, it's developing, you're auditing, um, but you need to tell them where you are. That's a part of the plan. We're just beginning the plan. Give us some time. We're going to communicate with you, right? That goes a long way as opposed to, we're not going to talk about this right now because it's not developed, right? Like you've heard that, like, oh, we have concepts, we don't have a plan. No, you need to tell me where we are in the process so I'm a part of the solution and that I know that I'm not being treated as a part of the problem, right? That begins the plan. So, whatever the plan is, taking it beyond just feedback, but now operationalizing actions, operationalizing who's responsible for what, making sure that there's a level of impact and accountability. Explaining all of that, believe it or not, just explaining that sometimes before we even get the plan could be the whole meeting. And that's a lot of things for people to take back with them and kind of absorb and saying, oh, now I understand what our diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy is, right? Now I understand how it's a business imperative. Now I understand what I individually can do to make a difference. Oh, now I understand how my department is a part of the larger corporation and how it's going to affect our revenue, how it's going to affect my bonus, how it's going to affect our brand reputation. I can go on and on. But the idea is to have a plan, and wherever you are within that plan, be transparent and share that information.
I like how you said the action, because that was what I was going to say. Action without intent yields poor results, right? So if you aren't intentional in what you're doing, so having these conversations, as DK said, go back to my 3 C's, communication, right? Are you communicating at each, as a C-suite level individual, people leader? Are you communicating at every meeting that you have with your team the importance of your DE and I strategy, your business strategy, your attraction strategy for bringing in more people, right? Are you communicating that? Are your leaders communicating that in town halls? So I say that it shouldn't just be a one-off. It shouldn't be a conversation that you have when it's like, oh my gosh, our numbers are low. We need to talk about this. No, if you're consistent in your communication with your team about having these conversations, because it's not a check the box. DEI is not a check the box, right? We want to ensure that everybody understands because it is so broad. I say one of my dear friends and mentors, Renee Myers, who was the VP at Netflix most recently, she says diversity is being asked to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance, right? So we think about that as we show up, as we're having these conversations, that we want to bring people in, but we also want to engage them, right? So having the clarity on what your business plans are, what your strategies are, is important to have that conversation with individuals. I find that oftentimes, sometimes leaders don't even know, right? They're getting it from the top and they're like, okay, yeah, I got to increase my representation of interns from underrepresented groups by like 10%. How am I going to do that? Do I really need to do that? Is this going to help me in the long run? But I've talked to leaders that say if you're intentional in driving this forward, it is going to be helpful because we know that having a diverse team or a team of individuals that don't just look like you, me, everybody else, but having an inclusive team yields better results.
Yeah, when I would just add, just to kind of close this out, is that when I think about DEI, and I'll add B for belonging, when I think about DEIB, two words come to mind. One you've already shared, which was intention. This work you will not be effective and successful in moving the needle and doing this work if it is not done with intention. And then the second word that comes to mind is embed. Yes, you need a plan, and yes, you should have a DEI strategy, and you should communicate what that is so that your workforce, employees, and leaders know. But I would also add that it should be embedded. It shouldn't feel like something separate that's off to the side, that it's like, here's our business strategy, our business plan. Oh, and by the way, we got this diversity thing that we're doing hanging off here to the side. This work and your plan and your strategy really needs to be embedded and pulled through everything that you do for the business, right? And so you do that by ensuring alignment, and that it shouldn't be felt like in addition to or an add. It should just be incorporated and embedded into everything that you're doing to achieve your business strategy. Like you mentioned before, business imperative. And so that's how you do that. So we're going to wrap this up and go into our last question. And our last question is, what does diversity in leadership look like, and how can organizations ensure that there's adequate representation from the top down? So we've touched upon talent acquisition. And at many organizations, when you really look at their representation, so the diversity piece, the representation, the actual numbers of women or people of color or LGBTQ plus, disability, etc. It's all about the numbers, right? And so at most organizations, when you look at the numbers, their numbers tend to be pretty good and meet most benchmarks at the staff or the low levels of the organization. But like a pyramid, when you advance and go to more senior levels of the organization, those numbers tend to become smaller and smaller. So it's really at the top. And if you speak to most candidates when they're going through the process and they're evaluating whether or not they want to join an organization, one of the first things they do is they look at two things. They look at the CEO and their senior leadership team, the top of the house, and some more seasoned candidates or more senior level candidates also look at the board. And so they look at the representation of the board of directors for the organization as well. And so talk to us a little bit about what organizations can do to ensure adequate representation, particularly at the more senior levels of the organization.
Go ahead. Okay. I think I took the last one.
So you look at a variety of things, right? But I think the most blaring is your executive team, right? Is to look at, what is the executive team? Is it all men? Is it all men and one woman? Is it all women and one man? I think the number one thing that people look at, whether you're a public company or a private company, is that executive team. And that's really important, not just from a visual perspective. And I want to really clarify this, because people often think, oh, just look and see if there's, a black, white, Latino, et cetera. No. When I say look at your executive team, it's what schools they went to, what industry experiences they have. Of course, culture, is it made up of all people from one area, international? It's all of the demographics, because in today's day and age, it's not just the visual diversity, it's also the diversity that you don't see, right? Is there somebody there that's on the neurodiversity spectrum? All of these things are really important. And very often when you're looking at the executive team, you also are reading their bios. So you're understanding how they got to where they got, how they became an executive, but most importantly, how they became a representation for that organization at the highest level. So that's the number one thing. And then the other thing I think is really important as you're looking at that is benchmarking it with their competitors, right? Are they best in class? Because usually what you learn from that is they're best in class because they have X expertise, or they've done this differently, or they've invested in this way. So telling that story, which is a huge part of storytelling, which is also part of the DEI strategy, is really important. So you start with the executive team, and then you start to benchmark. But then I'm a very big fan of this, believe it or not. What are people saying about the company? Like, what's in the news? I'll give you literally a huge example that just happened this week. I don't know if anyone heard what happened with Heinz, but Heinz had like two big, huge missteps. One in the UK and then one in the US. It was quite deplorable. I mean, we could have a whole conversation.
With an ad.
It was,
with an ad.
yeah, it was with an ad, right? But it was shocking because first of all, it's Heinz, so it's a pretty big organization. But when you see the ad, somebody should have caught that. And then it happened one in the US and one in the UK. So the question now becomes, if you're diverse, was this intentional? Like, what's really going on here, right? Which I honestly don't think was intentional. I just think they, because of the strategy, there was someone there that did not understand the multiculturalism in the strategy, and their quality assurance, their vetting process, their auditing was not done with the proper diversity filter, right? And I share that with you because what happens is this, now all you're hearing about Heinz is their misstep. So it's not going to sell more products, which is what the idea of the ad was supposed to do. You're actually now going to have a lot of people actually not buying that product, right? Not only of that diverse group, but other groups as well, because they're going to say, well, Heinz is not really paying attention. They're not being a good corporate citizen. And the quality of their product may be subpar because they didn't actually catch this, right? Consumers and companies now are all about purpose, right? Both as a consumer saying, well, I want to buy a product or invest in a product that represents my value, but also as a company where you're now basically have to focus on how you can make the most of getting every dollar out of the consumer for that product. So I share that with you because what's being written on social media, what's in the news, your public relations, all of that is a part of assessing how well you're doing, how well you're not doing, and the effectiveness of your overall DEI strategy, and holding your company accountable.
Thank you. Dimitri, you want to bring us home?
I'll bring you home real quick. So I'm going to take a different step and give you 2 questions to think about, right? Have I been intentional in my efforts to incorporate DE&I into my succession strategy? So for all the leaders out there, we talk about how do we keep it? What do we look at for our diversity and leadership? Have I been successful in creating that succession plan? And being intentional, again, have I been intentional? And then the other is what steps can I take going forward to create a culturally inclusive experience for my clients and for my organization? So I ask you to take those back with you to think about going forward. This is just a conversation we're having, right? We're having a conversation here, but what steps are you going to take going forward to help your organization be more culturally inclusive?
Thank you, Demetria. And on that note, that concludes today's panel. Please give a thank you to our esteemed panelists, Demetria and DK.
Thank you all so much again for an excellent session. I also want to thank everyone who joined us today. This session, along with all of today's content, will be made available on demand following the event. Our next session will begin shortly, so please click the join button that will appear on your screen to be redirected, and we look forward to seeing you there.